Historically, humans have used weapons in warfare, hunting, law enforcement, and criminal activity for thousands of years. Weapons also serve many other purposes in society, including use in sports, collections for display, and historical displays and demonstrations. As technology has developed throughout history, weapons have changed with it. Major innovations in the history of weapons have included the adoption of different materials, from stone and wood to different metals, and modern synthetic materials such as plastics, and the developments of different weapon styles either to fit the terrain or to go with or counteract different battlefield tactics and defensive equipment. Prehistory and the ancient world. As humans discovered new natural resources beneath the Earth's surface, traditional weapons were replaced. His methods for metalworking developed. Copper significantly contributed to the ancient world and helped cultures of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Indus and China flourish. Copper, the only metal known to man for a long period of time, replaced stone in weapons. During the Copper Age, maces were in high demand. The Sumerians were the first people on record to have used copper weapons. Native Americans mostly used flint spears and knives, but used copper for ceremonies and intricate decorations. Ancient artisans soon discovered the drawbacks of copper for producing armaments, as while weapons made of copper could be sharpened easily, they were not able to hold their edge. Along with maces, bows and arrows and slings were used in wars. Bow and arrow was preferred over spears because they were easy to handle, provided greater mobility, were more accurate, and did not require as much raw material. Bow and arrows were a boon for hunters as they could hunt more effectively with a bow and arrow than with a spear, and so the bow enabled ancient man to become the most efficient hunter. After the discovery of pure copper in Anatolia, around 6000 BCE, copper metallurgy spread in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Around 3500 BCE, the art of metallurgy spread into India, China and Europe. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, has been used as far back as 4500 BC, as it is much harder than pure copper. It was used extensively in Asia. The Indus Valley Civilization flourished as a result of improved metallurgy. Neolithic communities who lived primarily in the upper Yellow River in China also used bronze items extensively, as a number of artifacts were recovered at the Majorayao site. Bronze was produced on a large scale in China for weapons, including spears, pole axes, pole-based dagger axes, composite bows, and bronze or leather helmets. From the excavations at Zhengzhou, it is evident that the Chinese during the Shang dynasty had well-built walls, large buildings, bronze foundries, and bone and pottery workshops. Bows and arrows. Bows and arrows are one of the earliest forms of weapons known to archaeologists, with the earliest surviving examples of arrowheads dating to around 64,000 years ago from the Natal, in what is now South Africa. These early arrows were constructed from wooden shafts with a stone tip, which is advantageous over organic materials because it enables weapons to cut through tougher hides and create larger wounds, killing more easily. Bows and arrows had arrived in Europe by the late Paleolithic period, around 9,000–11,000 years ago, and seem to have arrived in the Americas by at least 6000 BCE. The oldest extant bows, from the Home Guard region in Denmark, date to around 6000 BCE. The bows were quite effective against the enemies that were far from the archer, and so archers were sought after in recruitment for armies. When people started horse riding at around 2500 BCE, composite bows were created. In 1200 BCE, the Hittites, originating from Anatolia, shot arrows using their bows on light chariots. In 1000 BCE, some of these horse-riding archers from Central Asia invented the recurve bow, which was in the shape of a W, and had an improved elasticity. People from the Nile used relatively long bows for better accuracy. They also used composite bows. Civilizations all over the world produce bows according to their respective vegetation. The Chinese made bows from bamboo sticks, while others who did not have the right kind of wood needed for making bows, produced composite bows. According to Chinese beliefs and mythology, a story is narrated and written in old Chinese texts which says how bow and arrow were invented. The Sumerians, known to be one of the earliest civilizations, the Sumerians lived in what is now known as Iraq. The occupied land was open to enemy attacks from the many barbarian tribes. The Sumerian warrior was equipped with spears, maces, clubs and slings. Sargon of Akkad is believed to have saved the Sumerian civilization from total collapse, around 2300 BCE. Sargon assembled an army of 5,000 soldiers which made use of domesticated animals in battle. For example, asses were employed for pulling chariots. The Sumerians had devised a strategy to attack the enemies while riding chariots that would keep them away from enemy weapons and at the same time rout the hostile troops. They used bows and arrows, which proved to be effective. The Egyptians For a long time the Egyptians enjoyed their strategic location, which was free from enemy attacks. Egypt was considered to be peaceful in the ancient world. They never considered training an army for the sake of invasion or defense of their own province. During the 15th dynasty, a tribe known to be the Hyksos surprised the Egyptians when they marched into Egypt in a second intermediate period with chariots and took the people of Egypt by surprise. The invaders used composite bows as well as improved recurve bows and arrowheads. According to historians, they came from Mesopotamia, but the exact location is still a mystery. Unlike the Sumerians, the Hyksos had horse-drawn chariots and not donkeys. They wore mailed shirts and metal helmets. They were also armed with superior daggers and swords. Chariotry was introduced to the Egyptians by the Hyksos. Tribes like that of the Hyksos had access to new and superior weapons which were most probably developed further away in Asia. These tribes, using these new and sophisticated weapons, started to conquer new lands and at the same time exchange their knowledge of weapons with other civilizations. The Egyptians, after a civil war with Hyksos, came to power once again. The Egyptians started to use horse-drawn chariots. Even before the Hyksos invasion, the Egyptians did not have a cavalry, as it is believed that the horses were smaller and not strong enough to support a rider. Ancient naval weapons. Fish was a major source of food in the ancient world, and the Egyptians lived on whatever the river Nile had to offer to them. Papyrus boats are reported to have been first constructed in the pre-dynastic period for the purpose of fishing. Most of the Egyptians used boats to transport warriors. In order to intercept a foreign boat, they used large stones, which they would hurl in the direction of enemy boats, by hand or using a catapult. The Egyptians traded with the Phoenicians in around 2200 BCE. For safety of their boats they would fix a bow. The Egyptian New Kingdom reorganized the standing army and also focused on making new and improved boats. During this period, Egypt's navy was extensive, and bigger ships of 70 to 80 tons suited to long voyages became quite common. Many cargo ships were converted into battleships. Seafaring was not safe, and in order to have smooth trading relations, they built a large fleet and took control of the sea. The Temple of Medinet Habu has reliefs depicting the fleet of Ramses III fighting a naval battle against the Sea Peoples. The Phoenicians are said to have developed the first war galley armed with a battering ram for attacking other ships in the ancient world. War chariots, a mode of transportation, were used as a weapon by ancient peoples. The Hittites used chariots to crash into enemies, whereas the Egyptians used them to stay away from enemies and attack them by arrows and spears. These vehicles were first made in Mesopotamia by the Sumerians, as four-wheeled wagons each pulled by 4 donkeys. Every wagon held 2 individuals, a driver, and a warrior armed with a spear or an axe. Some historians believe that chariots were first developed in the Eurasian steppes, somewhere near Russia and Uzbekistan. After the introduction of horses, it was discovered that they were much faster, and consequently chariots became more fierce weapons with the combination of speed, strength and mobility. The Hyksos introduced chariots in Egypt. These chariots were later modified into the Egyptian style. Parts were changed and decorated with Egyptian symbols and paintings. However, by the 15th century BCE, Thutmose III made 1,000 chariots for military expedition. Each chariot carried 2 men, one to drive and one to shoot arrows. Much later, the Egyptians changed their strategy and divided the charioteers into 5 squadrons, with 25 chariots in each and 2 men in each chariot, a driver and a soldier armed with bows and arrows, a shield, a sword, and a javelin. If arrows were exhausted, they would always keep swords as a backup for close combat. The khopesh sword, the khopesh, also called the Canaanite sickle sword, was used mostly by the barbarian tribes who lived near Mesopotamia. These tribes, who used to attack the Egyptians occasionally, used the khopesh as their main weapon. These tribes later started trading with Egyptians, and the Egyptians were so impressed by the shape and make of the sword that they decided to adopt it themselves. Ramses II was the first pharaoh to have used the khopesh in warfare during the Battle of Candish. The khopesh was designed such that it could be used as an axe, a sword or a sickle. The khopesh eventually became the most popular sword in all of Egypt and a symbol of royal power and strength. The Assyrian king Adad-nirari used to display this sword during ritual ceremonies, and such curved swords could be seen in Mesopotamian art and paintings. Some of these khopesh swords were black in color and came with a full tang. The average length of the khopesh was around 40 to 60 cms, which is likely why the Mamluk Sultanate based their sword, the scimitar, off of it. This weapon later spread all around the Muslim empires and to Eastern Europe. Trident, as the barbarian hordes from Germania were still using clubs and maces, the classical Greek civilization had mastered the art of making spears. The trident, a 3-pronged spear used for fishing, was a form of spear popular with the Greeks. This weapon was used in the East by the Indians, who called it trishul, and by gladiators in Rome known as rhetari, or net fighters. In keeping with the historical use of the trident in fishing, these net fighters would cast the net onto their enemies, and once their enemies were trapped and helpless in the net, would then use the trident to kill them or inflict serious injuries. The trident is also associated with various gods. Poseidon and his Roman counterpart Neptune were both associated with and often depicted with a trident, and the Hindu god Shiva also wields a trident. Assyrian Empire. Assyria was a northern Mesopotamian kingdom known for its wall-like culture. It was King Shamshi-Adad I at the start of 18th century BC who conquered lands to the west as far as the Mediterranean, and established the first Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian were first known to be barbaric, bloodthirsty people. Some part of this was true according to historians. They had set up schools to teach military warfare involving demolition of walls and mining city walls. The Assyrians were surrounded by hostile, powerful and aggressive tribes, therefore it was important for them to train their people. The Assyrian army was the first to use iron in its weapons. Unlike the rest of the civilizations, the Assyrian charioteers had a crew of 3 people, rather than the usual 2. An extra crew member was added to protect the rear. They were the first to introduce cavalry and the first develop siegecraft with siege towers and battering rams. Cavalry had completely replaced chariots in late 600 BC. The Assyrians had a very well-organized army. The king stood in the middle on a chariot, flanked by bodyguards and the standing army. The archers stood in front of the king and were covered by powerful spearmen and shielded carriers who fought in close combat with the enemies. Then there were the heavy chariots and the horsemen who would charge into enemy lines with brutal force. Ancient Greek weapons. Ancient Greece was surrounded by hostile neighbors such as Persia, Macedonia, and later Rome. The Greeks had adopted a totally different pattern of warfare and even fashioned their weapons differently. They had adopted a very strategic style of fighting, researching the strengths and weaknesses of their enemies, and developed their weapons accordingly. After incessant threats of a Persian invasion, the Greeks came together and formed the Delian League. The Spartans were ready for a ground assault while the Athenians relied on their strong navy. Sensing the military might of the Athenians, the city-states and settlers of Asia Minor requested them to lead the league. The Athenians had a formidable navy. They produced an overwhelming number of warships and soldiers and in return demanded tribute from the league members. The Athenians had built dozens of warships known as triremes to defend Greece. The crew consisted of 200 men, which included the captain, 10 dignitaries who may have been commanders, several archers, a few soldiers, and 170 oarsmen. When the Persians met the Greek army, they outnumbered it 3-1, the Persian army consisting of infantry and excellent cavalry. Their tactics were of a defensive nature since their main weapon was the bow. They were also supplied with the akanax, a dagger-like sword. The Greeks used long spears, shields, helmets and breastplates. The Greeks had no cavalry at this time. As soon as the Persian army came to the battleground, the Greeks already started to charge into the enemy lines to avoid the shower of arrows. The shield of the Greeks was so strong that it broke the spears of the Persians, much to their surprise. The long Greek spears, with sharp iron spearhead on a wooden shaft and a bronze butt spike, helped them break enemy ranks and rout the Persian army. If their spear was broken, they used their swords for close combat. Ancient Greeks brought many changes in the technology of warfare. The victories in the Greco-Persian War at Salamis and Plataea largely ended the Persian threat to the Greek mainland. With the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, inter-Greek warfare became more significant. The year 424 saw Brazier Days expeditions across the whole of Greece, proving wrong the idea suggested by the old oligarch that land forces could not sustain lengthy campaigns against sea powers. The Macedonians emerged as a power in Greece after the crippling of Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra. The ascent to power of King Philipp II, who through a combination of military power and diplomacy unified the Greek city-states and formed the Corinthian League to fight the Persians. The Macedonians followed the traditional military strategy adopted by the Greek city-states, the phalanx. Though unlike other Greeks, the Macedonian infantry was equipped with the sarissa, a spear as long as 15 feet with a leaf-shaped spearhead. Unlike the cities of Greece proper, the Macedonian army also had a dedicated cavalry, as the flat plains of Macedon were better suited to cavalry combat than the mountainous country to the south. The Macedonians' engineers had developed heavy weapons and artillery pieces, with enough power to breach the gates and walls of a fortification. Torsion catapults were also developed a little later, as well as heavy weapons such as the ballista, and the smaller, and more portable weapons. Cheruballistra were improved by King Philip II and Alexander the Great. The Romans, after Rome was sacked by the Senones in 390 BC, they regrouped and formed an alliance of the city-states. They deployed thoroughly trained soldiers in the northwestern frontiers to protect Rome from further attacks. These soldiers were divided into two groups, legionaries and auxiliaries. Legionaries were Roman citizens, whereas auxiliaries were recruited from tribes and allies of Rome. They eventually defeated the Gauls and gained total control of the Italian peninsula as well as northwestern Europe. The Romans never used complex weapons, instead they chose to use the more simple and unusual weapons of warfare. The armor and weapons were used under excellent supervision, great leadership and discipline that enabled the Romans to create superior military forces, both regular and irregular armies including mercenaries and allies, that were able to conquer their opponents. The gladius. The gladius was a light and short traditional Roman sword used for a quick kill. This was a short sword, not more than 60 centimeters long, made with an iron blade to which a bronze-covered wood, or ivory crossguard, pommel, and grip would be attached. The gladius varied in length and size as Roman soldiers of different ranks used a gladius measuring around 34.5 and 64 centimeters. The gladius was mainly used for thrusting and so had limited effect when wielded from horseback. The pilum. Roman soldiers were equipped with the gladius and pilum, a javelin with a long iron head. They carried two pila to throw at the enemy. The pila were designed in such a way that they could easily stick into the enemy's shield and would bend instantly due to the impact. This way the enemy, if unharmed, could not throw back the pilum.